Hello, welcome to Tea Time, the show produced by the New Jersey Tea Party Coalition. Welcome. Today we have Joe Connor as our guest. Joe is an author of The New Founders.
Thank you.
Thank you. I'm great to be here today.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you. Joe, we wanted to talk about not so cheery subject, terrorism.
Yep.
Right. Recently in the news, we have, in the last month or so, we've had Sergeant Bergdahl released in a trade, right, for 5. They call it the Taliban 5. We've seen the city of Mosul fall in Iraq.
Yes.
The Taliban is back. Before that, we've had Syria with the quote-unquote rebels and the ambassador and the 3 Navy SEALs, right, were murdered.
Yep, in Libya, yep.
In Libya. And so here we have in Syria, we're arming, right, the rebels. So do we have a policy? Is it anti-terrorism anymore, Joe, or what's
I think our policy is wrong. Let's start with that. If we look at what happened just most recently in the Taliban 5,
right.
This was an orchestrated release. And since Obama became president, even before, in 2008 and into 9, he talked a lot about closing Guantanamo Bay. And he criticized George Bush about having Guantanamo Bay open. Since he's been president, it's been cleared out to about 70%. So now you have him releasing, and really it was about releasing these 5 terrorists. And they were 5 of the worst terrorists at Guantanamo.
Right.
And I think the trade for Sergeant Bergdahl was just a ruse.
You think so?
Yeah, the idea was to get these 5 out.
Okay.
I think
that was cover?
I think it was cover. I think he would have released them outright if he could, but he knew the politics on that would be terrible. So they set up a release for a trade for this deserter, as it's turned out.
Right.
They didn't do their homework. They got burned. And now we have released 5 of the most brazen, evil terrorists that we've ever released, and we've released ones before. I know we're going to talk about that again. And we've put them back on the battlefield. The Taliban has said it's like giving us 10,000 new Taliban soldiers.
Is that what they said?
That's what they said. Yeah.
Oh, that's just great.
Yeah.
And they're in Qatar. They're not in captivity in Qatar, right?
No, they seem like they're in Qatar, but Lord knows what they're doing in Qatar. And and Qatar is a duplicitous country too. So we couldn't trust that. They're in Qatar, they're in safe hands. And even if Qatar was able to control them, I think the deal was for them to be there a year.
Right.
Well, a year for these guys is nothing. The jihad against us is not. It's not in 4-year increments like a presidency. It is centuries. They are very patient. A year for them is nothing. So what happens? We wait a year till we are killed, and they're perfectly happy to wait that year. But now look at the recruiting that they'll get by bringing these guys out, and the energy that they've brought back in. It's like bringing 4 or 5 4-star generals back on the battlefield.
Wow. And as you mentioned before, this is not the first time that Eric Holder and the Clintons have released.
Unfortunately, that's right, Laura. We heard Susan Rice and Chuck Hagel over the last couple of weeks say that Eric Holder, the Justice Department, vetted out these 5 releases.
Now, is that his job? I didn't know that that's under the purview of the Department of Justice.
Yeah, it's a good question.
Right?
I think that both of them said it as trying to give themselves cover for
So it's
this
no longer
release.
State Department.
Yeah, but it's the Justice Department. So as if that holds any sort of credibility with anybody who's paying attention.
Right.
But Eric Holder was he orchestrated the release of the FALN terrorists back in 1999 when Hillary Clinton was First Lady, and when she was going to be running for senator from New York against Giuliani, who was supposed to be her opponent. Her husband Bill offered executive clemency to 16 members of the FALN, the Puerto Rican terrorist group. They happened to kill my father. My father was killed by the FALN at Francis Tavern.
Back in 1975?
75, yep. When I was a kid and my brother was a kid. And so now you have Holder doing it again.
Right.
And that's the reason I testified at Holder's confirmation hearing in 2009 in front of the Senate Judiciary to warn Americans what this guy was all about. I said he didn't have the He didn't have the values, the character, the honesty to be our Attorney General, and he was playing Russian roulette with the American people by releasing the FALN.
Very prescient. And have you heard back from any of the senators who obviously confirmed
Well, you know, it's a great question. You know, when I was invited down there by the Republicans, and at the time there were 39 Republicans, well, 19 voted for Holder, so almost half of them voted for Holder, including Jeff Sessions, who I got to know, and I've actually, I've gotten to know him. I like Jeff Sessions. I think he's a good senator, but he voted for Holder. And a couple months ago, I was in the city at an event, and I ran into the senator. I introduced myself again, and he kind of remembered, and I said, you know, Senator Sessions, you voted for him. And he goes, I regret it. It was one of the biggest mistakes I've made. And he goes, can you forgive me? And I said, no, it's not about me forgiving you. It's not that at all. It's about doing what's right.
That's right.
And talking about it and making people understand what is right. And what is not right is putting a Attorney General in place who has orchestrated release of terrorists on the American people.
Or killing Americans.
Or killing Americans, yeah.
Right. And so there recently, so fast forward, so you've been working, you know, so steadfastly to keep the pressure on, right?
I've tried for an awfully long time.
Right,
Yeah.
so Oscar Lopez is the name, right, of the man who was one of them that was imprisoned, right?
Yes.
For acts of terrorism in New York, including Francis Tavern, and really throughout the country, right?
Well, none of the FALN were ever convicted of Francis Tavern that killed my dad. They were not convicted of that. They were convicted in Chicago of seditious conspiracy, of weapons possession, of possession of stolen goods, stolen firearms, and threatening to blow up government buildings.
Clearly not good guys.
Not good guys.
And so you just want to make sure we get this piece down, right?
Sure.
So they're not people that could be considered freedom fighters.
No, it's a great point. The FALN was not on the street protesting. The FALN were building bombs and blowing them up.
That's important for people to know, right?
And that when you hear people who are pushing now for Oscar Lopez Rivera's release from prison, they leave out a couple of things. One is that although he wasn't convicted of Francis, no one was ever tried for Francis. The FBI will tell you the economics of law enforcement back in the early 80s when these guys were convicted. They were sentenced to between 50, 60, 70, 80, 90 years over the 16 of them. They were essentially put away for life. There was no reason to bring them back to New York to face the Francis.
Got it.
It just didn't make sense. They were so committed to their cause that at their trial, some of them threatened to kill the judge, Judge McMillan.
Wow.
And one of them said, well, we're freedom fighters like George Washington. And McMillan sort of listened to that and he said, but if George Washington was caught, he'd have been hanged. And that was a real point because the judge would have sentenced him to death if he could have. As a matter of fact, he carried 2 loaded 6 guns under his robe.
So he wasn't fooling around. He knew they were dangerous.
He knew what they were like, and they were all put in maximum security prisons. Oscar Lopez was put away, and rightly so, first for 55 years, and then he tried to escape from prison twice.
He did?
Yes. And the FBI foiled the plot. But it was, had plastic explosives they were buying.
So the bombing has, I mean, clearly this is his area of expertise.
Oh yeah, this is what he does. I mean, one of the FALN members, one of them was a guy named Freddie Mendez. Freddie was the only one who talked to authorities. The rest of them didn't even speak at their trial. But Mendez said Oscar Lopez was the leader, was the recruiter, taught him the craft. And was his mentor and the leader of the FALN. So Lopez was clearly a hardened terrorist. When Clintons offered their clemency in 1999, Lopez turned it down.
Right, and the reason he did was...
Well, we didn't know at first. There were some stipulations on it. One was that you had to renounce terrorism, and another is you had to disassociate yourself with other convicted felons. So the rest of them took 30 days to accept the clemency, and they were allowed conversations between prisons, which is not Clemency is an individual grant.
Right.
It's not a group grant, but yet they were allowed to discuss with each other whether they were going to accept the clemency or not. So they took 30 days to accept the clemency, and during that time we were trying to keep them in and have Bill Clinton
Right.
rescind the clemency.
Right.
Finally, on September 10th, 1999, 14 of them walked out of jail. Oscar Lopez stayed behind. So he had during that whole time, he refused even a parole hearing.
Okay.
So suddenly, at the end of 2010, we got word that Lopez had accepted a parole hearing and was going to go up for parole in January of 2011.
Okay.
So I flew out to Terre Haute, Indiana, to the federal prison there with a couple of other victims and family members, and we faced him across a little table. And the parole examiner asked him why he turned down the clemency, and he said it was because Carlos Torres had not been offered executive clemency from Clinton, so Oscar was the captain going down with the ship. But in 2010, Torres was paroled, he was out of jail,
Okay.
Lopez was the last one, then he wants to get out. So now you have this Melissa Mark Viverito, the number 2 in New York City,
Right.
pushing for the release of a terrorist and having him as a symbol of the Puerto Rican Day Parade.
It almost takes your breath away, right? Because regardless of ethnicity, regardless of what, they made bombs.
Yes.
They blew up structures, and they hurt and killed people.
Yes, and all under what Lopez of the FALN would say, they were Marxists, okay, and they were talking about independence of Puerto Rico from the United States, but they had no intention of independence for Puerto Rico.
Right.
They had every intention of turning Puerto Rico into another Cuba and enslaving the Puerto Rican people.
Right. And I think
That
the Puerto
was their
Rican people
goal.
knew that, right?
Well, yes, because when they have had plebiscites on the island, only 5% have ever voted for independence.
Right.
And in 2012, over 60% voted for statehood. So there is
There's no popular movement within
popular
Puerto
movement.
Rico.
And most of the people who are on the Lopez bandwagon to get him released, they don't know the facts.
Right.
If you read the material the parade had released, it failed to mention that he turned down Clinton's clemency. It failed to mention that he tried to break out of prison. It treats him like he's some nice old man.
Right.
He's just happened to be in the wrong place.
Right.
You know, when we were at the parole hearing, we asked him, how, you were caught with bombs.
Right.
Yes, but I don't know how they got there. I mean, this is the kind of nonsense
So no
we're getting.
remorse
None.
whatsoever.
Laura, we went to that place, and we sat across from it, and all of us, it was my brother and me, and a man who was sitting with my father when my father was killed, and a woman whose husband was killed sitting next to them. And we were looking for a reason to forgive him.
Right.
We were looking, you know what? This is draining us. This is taking all our lives.
Right.
Like, if this guy comes out and says, you know what? I was a bad guy in my youth. Look what I did to myself, look what I did to my family. And if he started giving up some information about some of the other bombings that weren't solved, we would have been, you know what? Let him out.
Right.
But he didn't do it. He lied.
Right.
He was just completely...
There's no rehabilitation.
None.
Right.
And as we were walking out, one of the guards said to me, he's a piece of you-know-what. And it was clear. It was obvious.
I'm sorry you have to go through this. And it's mind-boggling because here you have the city council president of New York City, one of the largest city in the country, certainly,
She's
one of the most
number 2 in the city.
prestigious, right? And that's clearly, her position is clearly a fringe position. If the people of Puerto Rico are voting for statehood.
Right.
So help me with...
Well, you know what it is? If you lie to people enough, and they don't know the facts. All they're saying is Oscar Lopez is a political prisoner. He's a nice old man. Let him out. But if they were really in search of justice, right, they would want to know what he did, and they would want to know what the other members of the FALN did, and they wouldn't just say, well, Francis Tavern. He was never convicted of Francis. They would want to know, well, who did it?
Well, exactly.
If you really want justice for Oscar Lopez or for Frank Connor, my father, or for anybody. My father was born in New York, by the way. He was a New Yorker. He was killed in New York, and now he is the number 2 person in New York, discarding his life. So they're not seeking justice. You know what I mean? They are. It's a political thing. Laura, it's been amazing. I'll just tell you another story about it. It's somewhat related to this. About a year ago, well, I'll step back. A few years ago, there was a community center up at City College in New York, and it was called the Guillermo Morales Asante Shakur Community Center. Okay. Now, Guillermo Morales was the bomber for the FALN, who...
And he got a community center.
Yes. He blew himself up on what would have been my father's 37th birthday, July 12th, 1978. And he survived, but he was arrested, sentenced to 70 years or something like that. But he escaped from prison. And he ends up in Mexico, kills a couple of cops in Mexico, and instead of sending him back to the U.S., they sent him to Cuba. So now he's a guest of Castro. Asante Shakur was Joanne Chesimard, who killed Officer Werner Forster on the Jersey Turnpike. She's also in Cuba. So you have City College in New York having the community center named for 2 terrorists. So that had gone on. We came to our attention a few years ago, and they were supposed to have shut it down. And I didn't know if they ever did. So I went up there, and I saw it's still there, or it was still there. So I took some pictures, and I talked to people, and long story short, they shut it down. But the kicker to this story is that my father went to City College. So now you have a college who has put a student center in place, and there was huge protests when they shut it down.
Right,
People thought it was terribly unjust that you would shut down a place named for terrorists, and but they put something in place for terrorists over a student who actually went there. There was no Frank Connor Community Center.
Right.
So I mean, this is the sickness.
And your father was a
of what's going on
law-abiding
here.
prisoner. He worked in Wall Street. He was having lunch.
He was
supporting
33
his
years
family.
old.
Right.
You know, my father's parents both came from, my grandmother came from Ireland. Her husband, my grandfather came from England. My grandmother got a job at the Morgan Bank, which is now J.P. Morgan, as a cleaning lady. And when my father graduated high school, she got him a job down there. They grew up in Washington Heights.
Okay.
And she got him a job there so he'd be safe. A lot of his friends were becoming cops, firemen, or working in the subways. So he gets a job there. He went to City College for a while, then he dropped out, and he went to Fairleigh Dickinson in New Jersey after my brother and I were born. And he graduated. He was a real success story. And he happened to be having lunch with people on that day. And the FALN, Oscar Lopez, appointed themselves his judge, jury, and executioner. And they put on their communique that they were targeting reactionary corporate executives. So they were profiling.
Yeah.
They were profiling my dad. They were profiling white guys who happened to be having lunch.
Right.
And they killed 4. They meant to kill a lot more than that. The bomb was moved shortly before it exploded. So, you know, what we're talking about is cold-blooded, and you know, they're still out there. Eric Holder and Bill Clinton and Hillary Clinton, and it's important to remember when Hillary runs for president that she had a huge part in the release of terrorists.
Right. Her track record on terrorism is abysmal. At least protecting us. I mean, if you're looking at it from that side. And I think one of the things that we find people find difficult, I think, is the idea that people in government are supposed to be the ones watching out for us. Right? They're supposedly their role in whatever capacity. And so when we hear these true stories about members of our government releasing terrorists, promoting, whitewashing a terrorist background, positioning him as like granddad who deserves to be out.
Poor old Uncle Oscar.
Right, and so it's almost as though the terrorists are in government.
Well,
the terrorist sympathizers and the law-abiding citizens are
cast aside, and
or we're the ones, if we protest, then we're the ones
we're
the bad guys.
Well,
right?
let me tell you, this week I got interviewed by a woman from BBC International, the Spanish-speaking part of BBC. So
that must be funny. I'm sorry. Like, imagine Spanish in a British accent.
No, she was from Colombia, so yeah. But you know, it was actually, you know, it turned out it was a she put it together fairly. But some of her questions to me, one of them was, Joe, were you raised with hate? And you know, I said, of course not. I wasn't. And then I thought about it more, and I called her back the next day, and I said, you know, I want to ask you a question. She also interviewed Oscar Lopez from prison, and I said, did you ask the terrorist if he was raised with hate? And she said, no. I said, well, why not?
You made a presumption.
You
right?
asked me, whose father was killed by these people, if I had hate, but the person who's responsible,
Right.
you don't ask him if he had any hate. And I think I kind of stunned her. But and then she asked me why I can't forgive him. And I said, well, he hasn't asked for forgiveness.
That's right.
And I am a Catholic, and I have gone to church, and I do think about these things. And I've talked to priests, and they said, well, if people don't seek forgiveness, you are under no moral obligation to forgive them.
That's right.
And, but it's on me. It's on me to forgive Oscar Lopez. It's not on him to repent for what he did. So what you're saying, Laura, is so right. We are twisted.
Right, it's all
But with a
inverted.
victim, and I don't like the term victim, because I'm not a victim. My
Right.
father was killed.
Right.
I'm not a victim.
Right.
And anyone who
Right.
deals with me knows that.
Right.
But we are treated as the bad guys, and the terrorists are treated with the sympathy.
Exactly. So,
Yeah.
and I don't know if people realize that.
Well, if they don't, it's because they're not thinking about it, because
Right.
the track record's there.
Right.
And you can see what just happened with the Taliban. You can see with the original FALN releases. You can see, the Benghazi.
That would
We have our ambassador and 3 incredibly brave SEALs killed by terrorists. But the people who support Ambassador Stevenson, they're getting attacked. And if you're Eric Holder or Hillary Clinton, what difference does it make?
Right. Right.
So I mean, we've really reached a point in our country where right is wrong, or good is bad, and right is wrong.
It's like falling down the rabbit hole.
Yeah,
You
it's
kinda
it's
think-
hard to believe sometimes, and
Yeah.
it's hard to keep the energy up to fight it.
Right, absolutely, because we're being placed in a position where we're trying to turn back the revolution.
Well,
Do you know what I'm saying?
yeah,
Like,
I
it's
mean,
clearly a
you're right.
revolutionary act to free terrorists. Look what's going on at the border.
Well, look. Well, oh my God.
chaos. I
Well,
mean,
with bringing the children in, I mean, that's to me, that's the political equivalent of human shields.
It is.
They're allowing these children to come in on purpose,
Separated from their
and they're willing
families.
to let those children be. Whatever happens to children when they're left alone with strangers, it's generally not a good thing. And this government is willing to let that happen so that will draw more illegal aliens into this country.
Right.
So it's a human shield for them, because you can't kick out the children. That's what you're going to hear. That's the shield,
Right.
and then the shield will bring in the rest of these people. And it's the same thing as putting munitions near a hospital or near a grade school in war. It's the same thing.
It is, and so it feels like the laws are not being enforced.
No.
Whether it's, Oscar Lopez was, sentenced to prison. The judge wanted to.
Would have executed him if he could have.
Executed him. So clearly there was, judicial order was very strong, right? And then who gave Eric Holder the power, the authority to free any prisoners?
Well,
when
no
he was
one, and it was Clinton, but Clinton pushed. Holder pushed it. Look, we have a government that pushes. The founders, and I wrote the book, The New Founders, and we got a lot into the Constitution. But the founders didn't expect that we would ever have a government that would do these things.
Right.
They thought it could happen, and that's why they put impeachment in, and that's why they were.
Right.
That's why amendments. You could do amendments from the states, and they did some mechanisms, but they did know that if you have a tyrant and you are skirting the laws, there's not many ways to stop that, and we are working with a president who will push and push and push. And if people don't do anything about it, he is not going to stop. He will only be emboldened.
That's really clear, right? And where's the quote-unquote loyal opposition?
Well, hopefully we're
there
getting
is-
some. I mean, we saw Cantor lose recently.
Yes. What was that? And that was based on
His immigration.
Actually, his statement was picked up in all the Central American newspapers stating, "Bring your children."
Bring your children.
That was Cantor.
The people do have power, and it's funny because
Right.
you and I are considered, right wing or whatever. I just believe in the
Right.
Constitution. I
Yeah,
believe in
me
what's
too.
right.
Right, enforce the law.
Enforce the law of the land.
Right, that's it.
But also power to the people.
Yes.
I want
Right.
Right now we have power to the government,
That's
and we
right.
need to go back. I mean, the '60s slogan. I'm not sure that they really thought about it the way we're thinking about it, but we need people to understand that they need to take the power back. It's the power of the individual that makes this country. It's not a government, that's for sure.
It is, and exactly. And so with with Oscar Lopez, what can our viewers do? Should they write to the city council president? And
yeah, I think they should. I think they can write to Melissa Mark Viverito. She's the city council speaker in New York. But I also think you should reach out to any Puerto Rican or Hispanic leaders. I think you should call Geraldo Rivera.
Right.
I think you should talk to anybody that will listen about how to say, hey, look, if you're in favor of releasing Oscar Lopez, you're in support of terror.
That's right.
And Melissa Mark Viverito is in support of terror.
Exactly.
And if you want to condemn terror, you condemn this possibility for release. Because I am telling you, Laura, that in Obama's last days, he is going to offer clemency to this guy. And,
Absolutely.
And one last thing, when we were in Terre Haute, facing him at the meeting, at the parole hearing, he said when he got back from Vietnam, because he did serve time in Vietnam, he became a community organizer from Chicago. And his brother Jose Lopez still is, and from what I understand, is on a first-name basis with our president. And this is not.
So this is a very
true.
cozy relationship.
Absolutely.
Okay.
And you have Congressman Gutierrez in Chicago, who was more or less the political arm of the FALN, and he's still in Chicago. And you do have the connections between the FALN and the Weather Underground and the rest of them. So Bill Ayers is involved and is connected to this whole group. So.
He is, and so we just encourage everyone. if you've learned something today, and really have conversations with your family and friends about this too. Details and this is important.
And go on my website.
Right.
It's wewinamerica.com.
Okay.
wewinamerica.com, and I'm not selling anything. It has a lot of information. Google things, read up,
Right.
because what I'm saying is absolutely 100% correct.
It is. Thank you, Joe, and thank you for joining us this evening. Thank you.